Snow fell over the stone walls of Ashford Castle like a whispered confession, each flake dissolving against the amber glow of torchlight before it could settle upon the frozen courtyard. The evening of December the 14th, in the year of our Lord 1412, had wrapped the kingdom in a silence so profound that even the horses in the stables seemed to hold their breath, their warm exhalations rising like prayers into the darkening sky. Inside the great hall, 200 guests gathered beneath chandeliers of wrought iron and beeswax candles, their collective voices carrying the scent of mulled wine and anticipation. The rustle of velvet and the whisper of secrets passed between gloved hands. But outside, standing at the edge of the castle gates, a man watched the golden windows with eyes that held neither envy nor longing. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a cloak of simple wool that bore no embroidered crest, no silken lining, no mark of noble birth. His hands were bare against the cold, calloused from years of labor, and on his face was the expression of someone returning to a place he had once known and had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The summons in his leather pouch was 3 weeks old, creased from being folded and unfolded 100 times, as though he could not quite believe it had found him at all. His name was Thomas Blackwood. And tonight, after 20 years of silence, he had come to speak. The snow continued to fall. Somewhere inside the castle, musicians began to play a melody that drifted through the frosted windows like memory itself, carrying with it the weight of everything that was about to change. The great hall of Ashford Castle had been designed to humble. Its stone columns rose 40 feet toward a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of holy conquest, saints and angels frozen in eternal poses of judgment and mercy. Iron chandeliers hung like captured constellations, their candlelight fracturing against tapestries strategically placed to display the wealth and lineage of the Ashford family for 7 generations. Here, beneath this cathedral of power and ambition, the nobility of England had gathered to honor a most distinguished visitor, Her Majesty, Queen Catherine of Lancaster. The Duchess of Ashford had orchestrated every detail of this evening with the precision of a military campaign. Lady Margaret Ashford was a woman of 52 years, her silver hair swept beneath a jeweled headdress that added inches to her already considerable height, her gown of midnight blue velvet trimmed with ermine that had been shipped from the far reaches of the northern kingdoms. Her eyes, pale as winter ice, swept the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime categorizing human beings into those who mattered and those who did not. It was she who first noticed the man in the plain wool cloak. He had entered without announcement, without the herald of a page to proclaim his name, without the murmur of recognition that followed every other guest through the receiving line. He simply appeared at the edge of the great hall as though he had materialized from the shadows themselves, his cloak still dusted with snowflakes that melted slowly in the warmth, leaving dark spots on his shoulders like scattered stars. He carried no sword at his belt, no signet ring upon his finger, no visible proof of rank or station. His hair was the color of iron, worn longer than fashion permitted, and it fell in waves that suggested neither poverty nor carelessness, but something else entirely, something deliberate. The Duchess raised one eyebrow, a gesture so slight that only those nearest to her caught its meaning. Her daughter, Lady Eleanor, leaned closer. "Mother, do you know that man?" Lady Margaret followed her gaze and felt something cold settle in her chest, a sensation she could not immediately identify. The man was not handsome in the conventional sense, his features too weathered, his jaw too sharp, his eyes too penetrating. But there was something about the way he stood, something about the way he surveyed the room without a trace of intimidation, that made her suddenly aware of every titled lord and landed baron who surrounded her. They seemed somehow smaller. "I do not," she admitted, and the admission cost her something she could not name. The Duchess's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. How delicious, an uninvited guest at the most exclusive gathering of the season. One wonders if he has wandered in from the village, looking for warmth and scraps from our table. The comment was made loudly enough to carry, and several nearby guests turned to look, first at the Duchess, then at the object of her attention. A ripple of whispers began to spread through the hall, carried on currents of wine and curiosity. Thomas Blackwood heard the whispers. He had expected them. What he had not expected was the familiar ache that accompanied them, the old wound of being measured and found wanting, of being judged by the cut of his cloak rather than the content of his character. He had spent 20 years building a life far from these stone halls and iron chandeliers, far from the judgment of people who believed that worth was something inherited rather than earned. And yet, here he was. Because some truths once buried do not stay in their graves. He began to walk toward the center of the hall, his boots leaving faint impressions on the rush-strewn floor, each step deliberate, unhurried. The crowd parted before him, not out of respect but out of confusion. Who was this man who moved through their midst with such certainty? What right did he have to occupy space in their carefully ordered world? The Duchess watched his approach with growing interest. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of memory like a half-forgotten melody. But she dismissed the sensation. She had spent her entire life surrounded by the aristocracy of England. She would certainly remember if she had encountered someone of significance. "Sir," she called out, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade through silk. "I believe you may have mistaken this gathering for something more accessible. The servants' hall is through the kitchens should you require direction." The hall fell silent. 200 guests held their breath, goblets suspended mid-sip, conversations abandoned mid-sentence. The musicians, sensing the tension, allowed their melody to fade into nothing. Thomas stopped. He was close enough now to see the jewels in the Duchess's headdress, to count the pearls woven into her daughter's hair. Close enough to see the coldness in Lady Margaret's eyes and recognize it for what it was. Not cruelty exactly, but something older and more dangerous. The certainty that she stood at the center of the universe and that everyone else was merely orbiting her gravity. "Forgive me, Your Grace," he said, and his voice was low and rough, carrying the texture of long silences and distant horizons. "I was under the impression that all who received the Queen's summons were welcome in her presence." "The Queen's summons?" The Duchess laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Sir, the Queen does not summon common men in threadbare cloaks. She summons lords and ladies, earls and barons, those whose blood runs with the history of this kingdom." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "Tell me, sir, what is your name? What house do you represent? What title do you carry that would justify your presence among us?" It was a question designed to humiliate, to expose the interloper as a fraud or a fool. The Duchess had wielded such questions her entire life, had used them to cut down pretenders and social climbers, had watched countless men and women wilt beneath their pressure. But Thomas Blackwood did not wilt. "My name is Thomas Blackwood," he said simply. "I carry no title. I represent no great house. I am, as you have so astutely observed, a common man." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, the nervous relief of witnesses to a drama that seemed to be resolving in predictable fashion. The Duchess's smile widened. "A common man," she repeated, savoring the words. "How refreshingly honest. In my experience, those who are truly common rarely admit it so freely. They prefer to puff themselves up with false claims and borrowed dignity." She turned to her daughter, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. "Eleanor, darling, it seems your father's guards have grown lax in their duties. They have allowed a peasant to wander into our celebration." The laughter grew louder, more confident. Several knights began to move toward Thomas, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords, their intentions clear. They would escort him out, forcefully if necessary, restore order to the evening, and the incident would become an amusing anecdote to be shared at future gatherings. The night the peasant crashed the Ashford feast. But before anyone could reach him, a voice cut through the commotion, a voice that commanded silence simply by existing. "Hold." The crowd turned as one toward the raised dais at the far end of the hall, where a woman had risen from her throne. She was tall and slender, dressed in a gown of ivory silk embroidered with golden lions, the crown upon her head catching the candlelight like captured fire. Her hair was dark, touched with silver at the temples, and her face bore the kind of beauty that power had refined rather than diminished. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, eyes of deep amber that swept the hall with an authority that made even the Duchess pause. Queen Catherine of Lancaster had not been expected to intervene. Her presence at the feast was ceremonial, a gesture of royal favor toward a family that had served the crown faithfully for generations. Yet here she stood, her gaze fixed on the man in the plain wool cloak. "Your Majesty," the Duchess breathed, sinking into a deep curtsy. The entire hall followed, a wave of bowed heads and bent knees rippling outward from the Queen's presence. But Thomas Blackwood did not bow. He stood perfectly still, his eyes meeting the Queen's across the length of the great hall, and something passed between them that no one else could read. A recognition, a question, an answer that had been waiting 20 years to be given. The Queen descended from the dais slowly, each step measured, deliberate. The crowd parted before her like the Red Sea before Moses, leaving a clear path between herself and the man who had refused to bow. When she reached him, she stopped, and for a long moment, the only sound in the hall was the soft crackling of torches and the distant whisper of snow against the windows. "Thomas," she said softly, and the name carried the weight of decades. "You came." "You asked me to," he replied. The Duchess's face had gone pale. She looked from the Queen to the stranger, and back again, her mind racing to make sense of what she was witnessing. "Your Majesty," she began, "surely you cannot know this man. He is no one. He has no title, no position, no—" "Margaret." The Queen's voice was quiet, but it silenced the Duchess as effectively as a thunderclap. "Be very careful what you say next, because the man you have spent the evening mocking is the reason you still have a castle to call your own." The hall seemed to hold its breath. Every eye was fixed on the strange tableau at its center: the Queen of England, the Duchess of Ashford, and the man in the plain wool cloak who somehow stood at the heart of a mystery none of them understood. And in that moment, as the snow continued to fall and the candles continued to burn, Thomas Blackwood understood that the silence he had kept for 20 years was finally about to end. The truth, once spoken, could never be unspoken. And everything, everyone, in that hall was about to change. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one take you on journeys where every word matters, where secrets unfold like letters long hidden in dusty chambers, where the truth arrives not with thunder, but with the quiet certainty of snow settling on stone. If you believe that the best stories are those told with patience, with care, with the kind of attention that honors both the teller and the listener, then subscribe now and join us in this sanctuary of narrative grace. The solar of Ashford Castle had been designed for privacy. Its walls were hung with tapestries depicting scenes of courtly love, knights kneeling before their ladies, troubadours singing beneath moonlit balconies, their threads faded by decades of firelight and candle smoke. A fire burned in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the Persian carpet and the faces of those who had gathered within. Outside, the feast continued, but here, behind doors guarded by the Queen's own men, another kind of gathering was taking place. Queen Catherine sat in a high-backed chair by the fire, her posture rigid despite her years, her hands folded in her lap with the practiced stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime being watched. To her left stood Sir William Harding, her most trusted advisor, a man whose face revealed nothing and whose eyes missed less. To her right sat the Duchess, pale and trembling with the effort of maintaining composure in the presence of royalty and scandal combined. Lady Eleanor had positioned herself near the window, her young face a mask of careful neutrality. She had been raised to observe, to listen, to learn, and tonight, she sensed, would teach her more than all her years of tutoring combined. And Thomas stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the flames with the expression of a man who had waited a very long time for this moment and was in no hurry to rush it. 20 years, the Queen said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "I was not certain you would ever return." "Neither was I," Thomas admitted. "I had built a life far from all of this. A good life. Simple. Honest." He turned from the fire to face her, and in the dancing light, the years seemed to fall away from his features, revealing the ghost of the young man he had once been. I kept the promise I made to your husband, God rest his soul. I stayed silent. I stayed away. I let the world believe what it needed to believe. And yet here you are. Because you asked. Because the letter you sent said it was time. He reached into his cloak and withdrew a worn piece of parchment, the seal of the royal house cracked but still visible. Because after 20 years of silence, I found I still could not refuse a summons from the crown. The Duchess could contain herself no longer. Will someone please explain what is happening? Your Majesty, I demand to know why you have humiliated me before all the nobility of England for the sake of this nobody. The Queen turned to look at her, and the weight of that gaze made the Duchess take an involuntary step backward. Margaret, do you know why your family holds the Ashford title? Of course I do. The Ashford dukedom was created by His Majesty King Henry IV in recognition of my husband's father's service during the uprising of 1399. That is the story that was told, the Queen agreed, but it is not the truth. She nodded to Sir William, who produced a leather satchel and began to withdraw documents, each one bearing the heavy wax seals of official records. The truth is that the Ashford title was created not in reward, but in exchange. Lady Eleanor leaned forward, her earlier composure cracking. In exchange for what? It was Thomas who answered. For silence, for the burial of a truth that, if known, would have shaken the foundations of the kingdom. He moved to the table where Sir William had spread the documents, his fingers tracing the edges of papers that were older than anyone in the room save the Queen herself. In 1399, my father, Edward Blackwood, served as captain of the guard to the rightful king, Richard II. During that service, he discovered a secret so dangerous that it could have prevented Henry Bolingbroke from ever claiming the throne. The Duchess had gone very still. What secret? Thomas met her eyes. That the man who called himself Henry IV was not the legitimate heir of John of Gaunt. That he was, in fact, the child of an affair between Gaunt's wife Blanche and a visiting French noble. That the blood of the Plantagenet line, the very blood that justified Henry's claim to the throne, was interrupted. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to have stopped crackling, as though the very elements were holding their breath. That is impossible, the Duchess whispered. That would mean that every king since Henry IV has sat on a throne to which they had no legitimate claim, the Queen finished calmly. Yes, it would mean exactly that, including my late husband, including the king who now rules. Lady Eleanor's hand had flown to her chest. Your Majesty, surely you are not saying... I am saying that in 1399, my husband's father made a choice. He could have exposed the truth and watched the kingdom crumble into civil war. Instead, he chose stability over chaos, continuity over destruction. He swore Edward Blackwood to secrecy, and in exchange for that secrecy, he elevated James Ashford, Edward's closest friend who had helped conceal the evidence, to the rank of Duke. She paused, allowing the weight of history to settle. The Blackwood family received nothing, no title, no lands, no recognition, only the burden of a secret that could never be shared. Thomas nodded slowly. My father kept that promise until his dying breath. He watched the Ashfords rise to prominence on the foundation of his sacrifice. He watched the kingdom flourish under kings whose right to rule was built upon a lie. And he told himself that the peace was worth the price. His voice grew rough. My father died without ever speaking of it to anyone save me, and I have spent 20 years waiting for a sign that the silence was no longer necessary. The Queen rose from her chair, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who had spent a lifetime bearing the weight of a crown that was not quite hers to wear. She approached Thomas, and to the astonishment of everyone in the room, she took his weathered hands in her own. The sign is this, she said softly. My husband is dead. My son sits upon the throne, secure in his power, loved by his people. The wars that might have followed the truth have been prevented. The kingdom is at peace. She turned to face the Duchess, her eyes hard. And I am tired, Margaret. Tired of watching you parade through court as though your position was earned rather than given. Tired of watching your family grow fat on lands that should have belonged to better people. Tired of the lie that has sustained your pride for 20 years. The Duchess had pressed herself against the tapestried wall, her face a mask of horror. You cannot mean to expose this, the scandal, the chaos. I mean to do what is right, the Queen interrupted. Something your family has avoided for a generation. She released Thomas's hands and turned back to Lady Eleanor. Your mother has built her entire identity upon a foundation of sand. But you, child, you are young. You may yet choose differently. Lady Eleanor stood frozen, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had heard. The man she had watched her mother mock, the peasant, the nobody, the common man, was the son of the hero who had given her family everything, and her family had repaid that sacrifice with contempt. She looked at Thomas, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw not a stranger but a mirror. They were both children of secrets, shaped by choices they had not made, burdened by histories they had not chosen. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Something neither could name, but both could feel. The fire crackled. The snow continued to fall. And in the silence of the Ashford solar, the foundations of an old world began, ever so slowly, to crack. The following morning broke gray and heavy over Ashford Castle. The snow of the previous night transformed into a blanket of white that muffled every sound and turned the world into something hushed and holy. Thomas had not slept. He had spent the hours between midnight and dawn walking the castle walls, his footsteps leaving tracks in the fresh snow that were quickly filled by the continuing fall. He had walked past the towers where guards kept their lonely vigil, past the chapel where monks sang matins in voices thin as candle smoke, past the gardens where, in summer, roses bloomed in colors he had almost forgotten. Now he sat in the small chamber the Queen had assigned him, a modest room that spoke of his uncertain status, neither guest nor servant, neither noble nor peasant. The documents from the previous evening were spread across the rough wooden table before him, some dating back nearly a quarter century, their parchment fragile as autumn leaves, their ink faded but still legible. He had inherited these documents from his father, who had guarded them with his life until the very end. Among them was a letter that Thomas had never shown anyone. Not the Queen. Not Sir William. Not even his own mother, who had died 3 winters past without ever knowing the full weight of the secret her husband had carried. It was a letter written in 1399 by Edward Blackwood to his unborn son, a letter that had been sealed with wax and passed down with the instruction that it be opened only when the time was right. Thomas had opened it on the morning of his 30th birthday, alone in his cottage in the hills of Yorkshire, surrounded by the silence of forests that had no interest in the intrigues of kings and queens. He had read it once, then again, then a third time, and each reading had carved something deeper into his understanding of who he was and what he had inherited. Now, with the events of the previous evening still echoing in his mind, he read it again. To the child I shall never see grow to manhood, I write to you from a world of shadows and secrets, where truth is currency, and silence is survival. You are reading this because the time has come for you to understand the burden you carry, a burden I wish with all my heart I could have spared you. I discovered a truth that could have changed history. I was young then, and idealistic, and I believed that truth was always good, always necessary, always worth the cost of speaking it. I was wrong. The truth I discovered would have destroyed a kingdom, plunged England into civil war, and cost countless lives in the battles that would have followed. I weighed those lives against my conscience, and I chose silence. I chose to let a lie become history, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. But silence has a cost of its own. It corrodes the soul. It separates you from the world. It makes you a keeper of shadows when you long to walk in light. I have watched the Ashfords prosper on the foundation of my sacrifice. I have watched them grow proud and cruel, secure in their position, never knowing that their entire existence is built upon my father's grave. And I have asked myself 1,000 times whether I made the right choice. I still do not know. What I do know is this: The time will come when the silence must end. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but because some truths, no matter how dangerous, cannot be buried forever. They push up through the earth like flowers through stone, unstoppable, inevitable. When that time comes, remember what I'm about to tell you. You are not defined by what you inherit. You are defined by what you choose to do with it. Your father in blood and burden, Edward Blackwood Thomas, lowered the letter, his eyes stinging with emotions he had long since taught himself to suppress. Outside, the castle stirred to life, the sounds of servants and soldiers rising through the gray morning air. But here, in this small chamber, time seemed to have stopped, suspended between the past and the future, waiting for him to decide which direction to move. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. He rose, tucking the letter into his tunic, and opened it to find a young woman standing in the corridor. She was perhaps 20 years of age, with hair the color of dark honey and eyes like autumn leaves, and she wore a gown of deep green velvet that marked her unmistakably as nobility. But there was something in her bearing, something in the way she held herself, that suggested she was more than merely decorative. Lady Eleanor Ashford stood before him, and in her hands she carried a small leather-bound book. "Master Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor she could not quite control. "May I speak with you? There is something I must say, something that cannot wait." Thomas studied her for a long moment. There was fear in her eyes, but beneath it was something stronger, determination, the look of someone who had made a difficult decision and was committed to seeing it through, regardless of the consequences. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "I have a feeling that whatever you have to say, I need to hear it." Eleanor entered the chamber, her eyes taking in the documents spread across the table, the simple furnishings, the single candle burning on the windowsill. She seemed to be gathering her courage, and Thomas waited, patient as the snow that continued to fall outside. "I could not sleep," she began finally. "After what was revealed last night, after learning the truth about my family, about yours, I lay awake for hours thinking, remembering, trying to understand how everything I believed about my life could have been so wrong." She moved to the table, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the ancient documents. "My mother has always taught me that our position is our identity, that our title is what makes us worthy of respect, of love, of existence itself. She raised me to believe that people like you, people without titles, without lands, without noble blood, were less than us, beneath us, unworthy of our attention or our compassion." Her voice cracked. "But last night I watched you stand before her mockery without flinching. I watched you speak truth to a queen without cowering. I watched you carry the weight of a secret that would have crushed lesser men, and I realized—" She turned to face him, and in her eyes were tears she refused to let fall. "I realized that everything my mother taught me was wrong. That worth is not something you inherit, that dignity cannot be bought or bestowed, that the measure of a person is not the title they carry, but the truth they are willing to speak." Thomas was silent for a long moment, moved by her words in ways he had not expected. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I am ashamed," Eleanor said simply. "Ashamed of my family. Ashamed of the pride that built our castle on the grave of your father's sacrifice. Ashamed that I have spent my entire life looking down on people who deserved my respect, not my contempt." She held out the leather-bound book she had been carrying. "And because I found this, in my mother's private chambers, hidden in a chest she thinks no one knows about." Thomas took the book, feeling its weight, its age. The leather was worn smooth by years of handling, and the pages within were yellowed with time. He opened it carefully and began to read, and as he read, his face grew pale. "This is your mother's diary," he said slowly. "Yes, from the year 1399. From the months before and after my father received his title." Eleanor's voice was steady now, strengthened by conviction. "Read the entry from October. The one she wrote the night before your father was meant to testify before the council." Thomas found the entry, and as his eyes moved across the faded ink, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "James came to me tonight in great agitation. He says that Edward Blackwood intends to speak tomorrow, to reveal everything he knows about the king's true parentage. He says that if Edward speaks, everything we have worked for will be destroyed. Our position, our future, our very lives will be forfeit. I told James what must be done. I told him that men who cannot keep silent must be silenced. I told him that the kingdom's peace is worth more than one man's conscience. He wept. My husband, who has never shown weakness, wept like a child. But in the end, he agreed. In the end, he always agrees. Tomorrow, Edward Blackwood will not speak. Tomorrow, Edward Blackwood will disappear. And tomorrow we will receive the reward we have been promised. God forgive me, but I do not think he will. Thomas closed the diary. His hands were trembling. Your mother. My mother did not merely benefit from your father's silence, Eleanor whispered. She ensured it. She ordered his disappearance. Her voice broke. She had him killed, Master Blackwood. My mother murdered your father. The snow continued to fall. The candle flickered on the windowsill. And Thomas Blackwood, who had come to Ashford Castle seeking truth, found himself suddenly drowning in it. If this story has touched something deep within you, if you feel the weight of secrets and the courage it takes to speak truth, leave a comment right now with these words. The truth always finds its way to light. Let those words be your mark upon this story, your voice joining the chorus of those who believe that honesty, even when it costs us everything, is the only foundation upon which a life worth living can be built. The revelation hung in the air between them like smoke, thick and suffocating. Thomas stared at the diary in his hands, at the words that had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about his father's fate. For 20 years he had believed that Edward Blackwood had simply vanished, disappeared into the chaos of a kingdom in transition, swallowed by the same shadows he had spent his life navigating. For 20 years, he had told himself that his father had chosen exile over exposure, silence over sacrifice. He had been wrong. How did you find this? He asked, his voice rough. Eleanor moved to the window, unable to meet his eyes. I have always known that my mother kept secrets. She has a chamber within her chamber, a hidden space behind the tapestry in her solar, where she stores things she does not want found. Letters, documents, tokens from a past she never speaks of. She wrapped her arms around herself as though suddenly cold. I discovered it when I was 12 years old, curious and foolish enough to explore where I should not have. I saw the chest, but I never opened it. I was too afraid of what I might find. Until last night. She turned to face him, and in her eyes was the particular anguish of someone whose world has crumbled. When you stood before my mother, when you spoke of your father's sacrifice, I saw something in her face that I had never seen before. Fear. Not the fear of exposure or scandal. A deeper fear. The fear of someone who knows they have committed an unforgivable sin and has spent a lifetime running from the reckoning. She crossed the room and stood before him, close enough that he could see the traces of tears on her cheeks, the shadows of sleeplessness beneath her eyes. I had to know. I had to understand what she was so afraid of, and now that I know... Her voice broke. I wish I did not. Thomas set the diary on the table with deliberate care, as though it might shatter if handled too roughly. Your mother had my father killed. Your family built its fortune on his grave. And you... He stopped, searching her face for deception and finding only grief. Why bring this to me? Why not destroy it? Protect your family. Preserve the life you have always known. Eleanor's answer was immediate, fierce. Because that life was a lie. Because I cannot build a future on a foundation of murder. Because... She hesitated, something shifting in her expression. Because when I looked at you last night, I saw something I have never seen in any of the lords and nobles who have courted me. I saw integrity. I saw a man who had been wronged by the world and had chosen to respond with dignity rather than bitterness. I saw someone who deserved the truth, whatever the cost of giving it. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition, a connection that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. They were enemies by blood, strangers by upbringing, divided by every convention that governed their world. And yet, in this moment, they understood each other in a way that neither could explain. "My mother will be coming to find me soon," Eleanor said softly. "She knows I did not sleep last night. She will want to ensure that I have not done anything imprudent." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "I believe confronting my family's murderer with evidence of her crime counts as imprudent. What do you want me to do with this?" Thomas held up the diary. "This is your mother's condemnation. If I bring it to the Queen, if I reveal what is written here, then my mother will face justice. My family will lose everything. And I—" Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting his gaze with something that looked like courage. "I will have done what is right. For the first time in my life, I will have done what is right." Thomas studied her for a long moment. In the gray light filtering through the snow-covered window, she looked both younger and older than her years, a woman caught between the girl she had been and the person she was choosing to become. "You would sacrifice everything," he said slowly. "Your position, your future, your family name, for a stranger, for justice." "For truth," Eleanor corrected. "Truth is not about strangers or justice. Truth is about the kind of person you want to be when you look in the mirror. And I have spent too long looking at a reflection I despise." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, heavy footsteps moving with purpose. Eleanor's face went pale. "She is coming. My mother. She must have noticed the diary was missing." She moved toward the door, then stopped, turning back. "Whatever you decide to do, Master Blackwood, whatever choice you make, I want you to know that I am glad I met you. I am glad that at least once in my life, I had the courage to do what was right." She slipped through the door and was gone, leaving Thomas alone with the diary, the documents, and the weight of a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He looked at the diary in his hands, at the evidence of murder, carefully documented in the hand of the woman who had ordered it. He thought of his father, who had kept silence for the sake of the kingdom, who had believed that peace was worth any price. He thought of the Queen, who had spent 20 years living with a truth she could not speak. He thought of Eleanor, who had just destroyed her own future for the sake of a man she barely knew. And he thought of the lesson his father had tried to teach him in that letter written so long ago, that truth, in the end, always finds its way to light. The footsteps in the corridor grew louder, closer. Thomas tucked the diary into his tunic beside his father's letter and stood to face whatever was coming next. The Duchess of Ashford swept into Thomas's chamber without knocking, her face a mask of controlled fury. Behind her came 2 guards, their hands on their sword hilts, their expressions suggesting they would very much enjoy using those swords if given the slightest provocation. "Where is my daughter?" Lady Margaret demanded. Thomas met her gaze with the calm of a man who has nothing left to fear. "Lady Eleanor was here. She has since departed." "Do not play games with me, peasant." The Duchess's voice dripped venom. "I know she came to see you. I know she took something from my chambers. And I know—" She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "I know that whatever mischief you are plotting, it ends now." "Does it?" Thomas's voice remained steady. "I was under the impression that mischief was your particular specialty, Your Grace. 20 years of mischief, to be precise. 20 years of building a life on lies and murder." The Duchess went very still. For a moment, her mask slipped, and Thomas saw the fear that Eleanor had described, the terror of a woman who has spent a lifetime running from her sins and has finally been cornered. "I do not know what you are implying," she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "I am implying nothing." Thomas withdrew the diary from his tunic and held it up. "I am stating fact. Your fact, Your Grace, written in your own hand. The diary you have kept hidden for 20 years. The diary that documents your role in my father's murder." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, Whatever they had expected when they accompanied the Duchess, this was clearly not it. "That diary is stolen property," Lady Margaret said, her voice rising. "You have no right to possess it, no right to read it, no right to—" "I have every right." Thomas's voice cut through her protests like a blade. "I am the son of the man you killed, the son of the man who gave your family everything and received death as his reward. I have the right to know what happened to my father, and I have the right to see justice done." "Justice?" The Duchess laughed, but it was a brittle sound, close to breaking. "You speak of justice as though it exists for men like you, men without titles, without power, without the protection of noble birth. Justice is a luxury, Master Blackwood, and you cannot afford it." "Perhaps not." Thomas moved toward the door, the diary still in his hand. "But the Queen can, and I suspect she will be very interested in what your diary contains. You would not dare. Watch me." He pushed past the guards, who seemed uncertain whether to stop him or step aside. The Duchess's voice followed him into the corridor, high and desperate. "You think the Queen will believe you? You think she will take the word of a common man over the word of a Duchess? You are nothing, Blackwood. Nothing. And when this is over, when the Queen has dismissed your accusations as the ravings of a jealous peasant, I will ensure that you suffer for this humiliation. I will ensure that—" But Thomas was no longer listening. He was walking through the stone corridors of Ashford Castle, his father's letter in one pocket and his mother's murderer's confession in the other, carrying the truth toward the only person with the power to act upon it. He found the Queen in the castle's private chapel, kneeling before the altar in silent prayer. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across her bowed head, transforming her into something almost sacred. Thomas waited at the entrance, unwilling to interrupt, until she crossed herself and rose. "Master Blackwood." Her voice carried no surprise. "I had wondered when you would come." "Your Majesty." He knelt, properly this time, his head bowed. "I have discovered something that changes everything. Rise." The Queen moved to a wooden bench against the wall and sat, gesturing for him to join her. "Tell me." He told her everything, about Eleanor's visit, about the diary, about the confession it contained. He showed her the relevant entries, watched her face as she read the words that documented her old friend's betrayal, her husband's unwitting complicity, the murder that had been committed in the name of ambition and security. When she finished reading, the Queen was silent for a long moment. Her hands, still holding the diary, trembled almost imperceptibly. "I knew Margaret was ambitious," she said finally. "I knew she would do almost anything to advance her position. But this—" She closed her eyes. "This I did not expect. What will you do, Your Majesty?" The Queen opened her eyes and looked at him, truly looked at him, as one human being looks at another when the pretenses of rank and station have fallen away. "I will do what must be done," she said. "Margaret will face judgment. The Ashford title will be stripped. The lands that were granted in exchange for your father's silence will be restored to those who earned them." She paused. "To you, Thomas. They will be restored to you." Thomas shook his head. "I did not come here seeking lands or titles. I came seeking truth. And you found it. But truth has consequences, Thomas. Justice has requirements. Your father gave everything for this kingdom. His honor, his future, his life. The least the kingdom can do is acknowledge that sacrifice." She rose, holding the diary against her chest. "I will make the announcement tonight, at the feast. The nobility of England will learn what the Ashfords truly are, and they will learn what the Blackwoods truly deserve. Your Majesty?" "This is not a request, Thomas." For the first time, a hint of warmth entered the Queen's voice. "This is justice, 20 years delayed. Accept it. Accept it for your father's sake, if not for your own." Thomas bowed his head. "As your Majesty commands." The Queen moved toward the chapel door, then paused. "There is one more thing. Lady Eleanor, the daughter. What is to become of her? Thomas thought of Eleanor's face as she handed him the diary. The fear in her eyes, the determination, the courage it had taken to betray her own mother for the sake of a stranger. She is not responsible for her mother's sins, he said slowly. She came to me. She gave me the truth, knowing it would destroy her. If anyone deserves mercy in this affair, it is her. The Queen nodded, something like approval flickering in her gaze. Very well. Lady Eleanor will not be punished for her mother's crimes. Indeed, I believe she may have demonstrated the very qualities that her mother lacks: honesty, courage, integrity. She smiled, a rare expression that transformed her stern features. Qualities that would serve a nobleman's wife well, should such a match ever be contemplated. Thomas felt heat rise to his face. Your Majesty, I am merely making an observation, Thomas. Nothing more. The Queen swept from the chapel, leaving him alone with the colored light and the echo of her words. The great hall of Ashford Castle had never been so silent. 200 guests stood in frozen tableau, their faces reflecting the candlelight and the shock of what they had just witnessed. The Queen had spoken, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, and the words she had spoken had changed everything. The Duchess of Ashford knelt in the center of the room, her fine gown pooling around her like a lake of midnight blue. Her jeweled headdress tilted at an angle that would have been comical under other circumstances. The guards who had escorted her from her chambers stood on either side, their expressions carefully neutral, as though they transported accused murderers every day. Margaret Ashford, the Queen said, her voice carrying the weight of royal authority, you stand accused of conspiracy to commit murder, of ordering the death of Edward Blackwood, a loyal servant of the Crown, for the purpose of concealing information that would have threatened your family's position, of maintaining silence about this crime for 20 years while enjoying the fruits of your victim's sacrifice. The Duchess raised her head, and in her eyes was something that might have been defiance or might have been despair. Your Majesty, You will speak when given permission to speak. The Queen's voice cut like a blade. The evidence against you has been presented. Your own diary in your own hand, confessing to this crime. Do you deny that you wrote these words? Do you deny that you ordered Edward Blackwood's death? A moment of terrible silence. Then, slowly, the Duchess shook her head. I do not deny it, she whispered. I did what I believed was necessary. I did what I thought was right for my family, for the kingdom, for the stability of the realm. Her voice strengthened, taking on a note of desperate justification. Edward Blackwood was going to destroy everything. He was going to speak the truth about the king's lineage, to plunge England into civil war, to cost thousands of lives in the chaos that would follow. I made a choice. A terrible choice, yes, but one that saved the kingdom from destruction. You made a choice to commit murder, the Queen replied coldly. You made a choice to benefit from another man's sacrifice by ensuring he could never claim the reward he was owed. You made a choice to build your family's future on a foundation of blood and betrayal. She paused, allowing the words to sink in. And now you will face the consequences of that choice. The Duchess's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face, cutting channels through the powder and paint. Please, Your Majesty, please. I have a daughter, a child who knew nothing of this. Whatever punishment you decree, whatever justice demands, please do not make her pay for my sins. Your daughter has already been considered. The Queen's voice softened slightly. Lady Eleanor came forward of her own accord. She brought the evidence of your crime to Master Blackwood, knowing full well what it would cost her. She has demonstrated more honor in one night than you have shown in 20 years. She glanced toward the edge of the hall, where Eleanor stood pale and trembling, her eyes fixed on her kneeling mother. Lady Eleanor will not be punished. Indeed, she will be rewarded for her courage, for her integrity, for her willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of truth. Eleanor's eyes met Thomas's across the crowded hall. In that gaze was gratitude and fear and something else, something that looked almost like hope. As for you, Margaret Ashford, the queen's voice hardened once more. "You are hereby stripped of your title. Your lands are forfeit to the crown. You will spend the remainder of your days in a convent of my choosing, where you will have ample time to contemplate your sins and pray for forgiveness." She rose from her chair, her figure commanding despite her years. "Take her away." The guards moved forward, lifting the Duchess to her feet. She did not resist, did not cry out, did not plead. She simply walked between her escorts, her head bowed, her spirit broken. As she passed Eleanor, she paused for a moment, reaching out one hand as though to touch her daughter's face. But Eleanor stepped back, and the Duchess's hand fell, empty, to her side. Then she was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the corridor, and a chapter of history that had lasted 20 years came, finally, to its end. The queen turned to face the assembled nobility. "Let this be a lesson to all who witness it," she said. "Position is not destiny. Title is not truth. And justice, however long delayed, will always find its way to those who deserve it." She held out her hand, and Thomas, recognizing the gesture, stepped forward and knelt before her. "Thomas Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Son of Edward Blackwood, whose sacrifice preserved the peace of this kingdom and whose murder has at last been avenged. In recognition of your father's service, and in acknowledgement of the debt the crown has owed your family for 20 years, I hereby bestow upon you the title of Earl of Blackwood. The lands that were wrongly given to the Ashfords are restored to you. The honors that were wrongly denied are now granted." She drew a sword from the hands of a waiting page and touched it to each of Thomas's shoulders. "Rise, Earl of Blackwood. Rise, and take your rightful place among the nobility of England." Thomas rose. Around him, the hall erupted in applause, some genuine, some merely politic, but all acknowledging the extraordinary transformation they had witnessed. A common man had entered this castle 2 days ago, mocked and dismissed and scorned. A nobleman was leaving it, vindicated and honored and restored. But as the applause continued, Thomas's eyes sought only one face in the crowd. Eleanor stood where she had been standing throughout the ceremony, her expression a complex mixture of emotions: relief, sorrow, hope, uncertainty. She had lost everything tonight: her mother, her title, the life she had always known. She was, in the eyes of the world, no one, just as he had been 2 days ago. Thomas walked toward her, ignoring the nobles who sought to congratulate him, ignoring the whispers that followed his progress. When he reached Eleanor, he stopped, looking down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Lady Eleanor," he said softly, too quietly for anyone else to hear, "I find myself in an unusual position. I have just been granted lands and a title that I never sought. I have just been elevated to a station that I do not entirely understand. And I have been told that such a station requires a wife, a companion who can help me navigate this new world I have stumbled into." Eleanor's eyes widened. "My lord, I am not asking you to answer now," Thomas continued. "I am merely asking you to consider. You showed me courage tonight, and honesty, and integrity. You sacrificed everything for the sake of truth. Those are not common qualities, Lady Eleanor. Those are not qualities that can be taught or bought or inherited." He took her hand, feeling the tremor in her fingers. "I believe they are qualities that should be honored, and I would be honored when you are ready to honor them myself." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, but she was smiling. A genuine smile, the first she had worn since this nightmare began. "I will consider, my lord," she whispered. "I will consider very carefully indeed." The winter melted slowly from the hills of the Blackwood estate, revealing meadows of new grass and forests coming alive with birdsong. Thomas stood at the window of his new home, a manor house that had been built by the Ashfords but now bore the Blackwood name above its door, watching the sun rise over a world transformed. 3 months had passed since that night at Ashford Castle. 3 months of change, of adjustment, of learning to inhabit a life he had never expected to live. He had met with stewards and tenants, reviewed accounts and resolved disputes, performed all the duties that came with his unexpected title. And through it all, Eleanor had been at his side. She had accepted his proposal a month after the Queen's decree, in a quiet ceremony attended only by the closest witnesses. There had been whispers, of course. There were always whispers in the noble world, about the daughter of a murderess marrying the son of her mother's victim. But the whispers had faded as the weeks passed, replaced by grudging acknowledgement that the new Earl and his bride seemed genuinely suited to each other. Now Eleanor came to stand beside him at the window, her dark honey hair loose about her shoulders, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where new life was growing. "You are thinking of your father," she said softly. It was not a question. Thomas nodded. "I wonder what he would think of all this. The title he never wanted, the lands he never sought, the justice that came 20 years too late. I think he would be proud." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. Proud that his son became a man worthy of honor. Proud that the truth he protected found its way to light. Proud that the sacrifice he made was not forgotten. "And you?" Thomas turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "Are you proud? You lost everything, Eleanor. Your mother, your position, your past. You gave it all up for a man you barely knew." Eleanor's smile was gentle, knowing. "I gave up a lie for the truth. I exchanged a hollow position for a genuine place in the world. I traded a mother who loved her ambition more than her daughter for a husband who loves me more than himself." She reached up to touch his face. "If that is lost, Thomas, then I pray I lose more every day." He kissed her then, there in the morning light, with the promise of spring unfolding beyond the window, and the promise of a future they would build together, stretching before them. When they parted, Eleanor produced a letter from the folds of her gown. "This came this morning, from the convent where my mother is being held." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. The Duchess had been silent since her imprisonment, refusing to write, refusing to receive visitors, refusing to acknowledge the world she had left behind. "What does it say?" Eleanor unfolded the letter. Her hands were steady, but her voice trembled slightly as she read. "My daughter, I do not expect your forgiveness. I do not deserve it. What I did to the Blackwood family, what I did to you, by raising you to believe that worth could be inherited rather than earned, these are sins that cannot be absolved by prayers or penitence. But I want you to know that I have found, in these months of silence and solitude, something I never possessed when I was free. Clarity. I understand now what I was too proud to see before, that the title I treasured was a prison, that the position I fought to maintain was a cage, that the only thing that ever truly mattered, your love, your trust, your presence in my life, was the thing I sacrificed most carelessly. I am told that you have married Thomas Blackwood. I am told that you are happy. I am told that the child you carry is healthy and that the future before you is bright. I am glad, more glad than you can know, because your happiness proves that we are not bound by the sins of our parents, that we can choose each day who we want to become, that love, given freely and honestly, is worth more than all the titles in England. Be happy, Eleanor. Love your husband. Raise your children in truth. And if someday you can find it in your heart to forgive the woman who failed you, know that I will be here praying for your peace until my last breath." Your mother, Margaret Eleanor, folded the letter and placed it in Thomas's hands. She is not asking for release. She is not pleading for mercy. She is simply acknowledging the truth, Thomas finished, perhaps for the first time in her life. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the letter settling between them like dust motes in sunlight. Then Eleanor took a deep breath. "I will write back," she said. "I will tell her about our life here, about the child, about the person I am becoming. Not because I forgive her, not yet, perhaps not ever, but because—" She paused, searching for words. "Because some connections cannot be severed, even when they should be. because she is my mother, for better or worse, and because I want her to know that the truth she fought so hard to bury has borne fruit she never expected." Thomas put his arm around her, drawing her close. "You are a better person than I am, Eleanor Blackwood, a more compassionate person, a more forgiving person." "I learned from the best," she replied, smiling up at him. "From a man who carried a burden of secrets for 20 years and chose to respond with dignity rather than bitterness. From a man who had every reason to hate my family and instead chose to love me." "That," Thomas said, kissing her forehead, "was the easiest choice I ever made." Outside the window, the sun climbed higher, bathing the Blackwood estate in golden light. In the meadows, new lambs bleated for their mothers. In the forests, birds sang the ancient songs of spring. And in the manor house, two people who had been shaped by lies stood together in truth, looking forward to a future they would build on the only foundation that mattered. The foundation of honesty, the foundation of courage, the foundation of love. The garden of Blackwood Manor was in full bloom. Roses climbed the stone walls, their fragrance filling the warm June air. Bees hummed among the flowers, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. It was the kind of afternoon that seemed to exist outside of time, a moment of perfect peace in a world that so rarely offered such gifts. Eleanor sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree, a book open in her lap, but unread. In her arms, swaddled in finest linen, slept a child of 4 months, a boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's autumn eyes, whom they had named Edward, in honor of the grandfather he would never know. Thomas approached from the manor house, a letter in his hand and a smile on his face. "News from London," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "The Queen sends her congratulations on young Edward's christening. She wishes us to know that she considers the House of Blackwood to be among the most honored in her realm." Eleanor smiled. High praise from a woman who does not offer it lightly. Indeed. Thomas looked down at his sleeping son, and his face softened with an emotion that went beyond words. "She also writes that she has visited my mother at the convent. She says that Margaret seems changed, more peaceful, more accepting of her circumstances. My mother is learning what it means to live without pretense," Eleanor said quietly. "It is a hard lesson, but perhaps a necessary one." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the play of light through the leaves, listening to the distant sounds of the estate coming alive with summer activity. "I received another letter today," Thomas said finally, "from a man named Robert Walsh who says he was my father's squire during the troubles of '99. He has written to congratulate me on my restoration and to share memories of Edward Blackwood, memories I never knew existed." Eleanor looked at him. "What does he say?" Thomas withdrew a worn piece of parchment from his tunic and began to read. "My lord, I served your father during the most turbulent years of our kingdom's history, and I count it the greatest honor of my life. Edward Blackwood was not merely a soldier or a guardian of secrets. He was a man of uncommon wisdom and integrity, who taught me by example what it means to live with honor in a dishonorable world. I remember in particular a conversation we had on the night before he disappeared. He spoke of you, my lord, of the son he had not yet met, of the hopes he held for your future. He said that he did not know what fate awaited him, but he knew that whatever happened, his choices would be vindicated by the man you became. He said, 'I have learned that we are not made by the accidents of our birth, but by the intentions of our hearts. We are not defined by the secrets we keep, but by the truths we have the courage to speak. And we are not measured by the titles we carry, but by the love we leave behind.' I have carried those words with me for 20 years, my lord. And now, seeing the man you have become, seeing the family you are building, seeing the legacy your father's sacrifice has finally produced, I know that his faith was not misplaced. May God bless you and yours, now and always. Your servant, Robert Walsh Thomas, folded the letter and pressed it to his chest, feeling the connection across time and space. The bond between a father he had never known and a son who finally understood him. He knew, Eleanor said softly. Your father knew somehow that this day would come, that the truth would find its way to light, that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. He knew, Thomas agreed, and he trusted. He trusted that the world, however cruel, however unjust, would eventually remember what matters. He looked at his sleeping son, at the new life that carried forward everything his father had believed and sacrificed and hoped for. And he was right. The church bell tolled again, marking the passage of another hour in an afternoon that seemed to stretch into eternity. The roses climbed higher on their trellises. The bees continued their ancient work. And in the garden of Blackwood Manor, a family born from secrets and tragedy found at last the peace they had earned. Eleanor leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder, feeling the warmth of the sun and the weight of their child and the presence of the man she loved. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Thomas smiled, a genuine smile, free of shadows. "I am thinking that my father was right, that we are not defined by what we inherit, but by what we choose. That truth, however long delayed, always finds its way to light." He kissed the top of her head. "And I am thinking that I am the luckiest man in England." "Only England?" "In all of Christendom, then. In all the world. In all of history and all of time." Eleanor laughed, a sound like bells, like birdsong, like everything good and true in the world. And in the garden, beneath the summer sun, surrounded by roses and happiness and the promise of tomorrow, the Earl and Countess of Blackwood held their child and looked forward to all the years to come. For they had learned what it meant to be truly free. And that freedom, hard-won and precious, was worth more than any title in the world.